During the Second World War, military strategists on both sides believed that the bombings of civilian areas would have a devastating effect on morale. The bombarding of London by German forces was expected to plunge the British people into chaos, with fear and panic tearing the social fabric apart. Yet, something remarkable happened instead. The relentless bombing, which could have driven communities into despair, instead forged a stronger sense of unity and resilience. People came together in unexpected ways. Neighbours who had never spoken before shared shelters, resources, and hope. The famous British "keep calm and carry on" spirit wasn't just propaganda. It was a lived experience. People adapted, maintained their routines as best they could, and supported one another through the darkest of times. Similarly, when the Allied forces later bombed Germany, military leaders expected that this would break the will of the German people. Instead, much like in London, communities in Germany banded together. Faced with loss and destruction, people found solidarity with their fellow citizens. They shared what little they had, rebuilt homes side by side, and found solace in knowing they were not facing the devastation alone. The bombings that were meant to create chaos instead reinforced a profound, innate human instinct. When catastrophe strikes, people often come together, rather than fracture. This reality stands in stark contrast to the narrative often found in pop culture, where unity is portrayed as requiring a monumental, manufactured disaster. Take, for example, Watchmen by Alan Moore. The story's central premise hinges on a calculated, simulated catastrophe designed by the antagonist, Ozymandias, to force humanity to set aside its differences and cooperate in the face of the greater existential threat. Ozymandias, believing that the world teeters on the brink of nuclear annihilation due to Cold War tensions, orchestrates a catastrophic event that results in mass casualties. His goal is to unite the superpowers and the world's divided nations against a common, albeit fabricated, enemy. In his eyes, the ends justify the means, and the only way to save humanity is through an unthinkable sacrifice that shocks it into cooperation. This theme is compelling, and it's not limited to Watchmen. Many other works of fiction have played with similar ideas, where a leader or figure simulates or induces a disaster to bring people together. In the film The Dark Knight, the Joker sets up a moral conundrum that pits two groups of people against each other on boats rigged with explosives, aiming to prove that under pressure, humans revert to selfishness. However, the outcome shows a glimmer of hope when neither group pulls the trigger, suggesting that people can choose empathy over fear. Similarly, the movie Kingsman. The Secret Service features a villain who initiates global violence with the belief that humanity needs a wake-up call to address overpopulation and climate change. Even in historical tales, we see echoes of leaders who might consider the Machiavellian approach, create or exacerbate a crisis to rally people under a single banner of survival. These narratives are fascinating and impactful, not as criticisms of humanity, but as explorations of human behavior when faced with existential threats. There is a certain truth in the notion that shared challenges can foster unity. History has shown us that moments of great adversity can indeed bring out the best in people, forcing them to set aside differences and collaborate for survival. We see this in times of war, natural disasters, and large-scale tragedies, where people band together to protect and support one another. These stories reflect a certain hope that even in our darkest moments, we are capable of extraordinary acts of compassion and solidarity. But while these narratives capture an important aspect of human behavior, they might miss a key point. It's not necessarily the catastrophe itself that breeds unity. It's the realization of shared vulnerability and the breaking down of barriers between people. The truth is, we are surrounded by crises every day. Poverty, war, economic inequality, climate change, and social injustice are ongoing realities for millions. Yet, they don't always inspire the same level of universal response or cooperation. The reason for this, perhaps, isn't that the crises aren't severe enough, but that we haven't bridged the human connections necessary for widespread empathy. The pop culture idea that humanity needs a grand catastrophe to spark connection overlooks the fact that we already have ample adversity in our midst. What we often lack is the willingness or ability to connect on a personal level with those who are different from us. During the bombings of London and Germany, people came together not because of the bombs themselves, but because the shared experience of fear and loss dismantled social and economic barriers. People were forced to see each other not as strangers, but as fellow human beings facing the same existential threat. This same principle can be seen in the lives of social workers, aid workers, and those who dedicate themselves to helping refugees and vulnerable populations. Many people who start working with marginalized communities find themselves drawn deeper into the work, compelled by the human stories and connections they form. These individuals don't need a catastrophic event to remind them to care. They care because they have witnessed the struggle firsthand and formed bonds with those affected. The human instinct to help and cooperate is ignited by personal connection, not just by shared tragedy. So, if we already have bad things happening around us, what's missing? It's the dismantling of the silos that keep us apart, silos built on social, economic, and cultural differences. We naturally rally to help friends and family in times of trouble, so why not extend that circle of empathy to include more people? The lesson of both the real-life wartime experience and the fictional depictions is that the key to unity lies not in waiting for the next grand catastrophe, but in building connections now before they're needed most. When we choose to engage with others outside of our usual circles, when we recognize that someone living a different reality is still just as human as we are, we foster the kind of unity that transcends crisis. Imagine a world where we don't need a disaster to tear down the walls between us. What if we acted now to reach out, understand, and connect? What if, instead of waiting for a catastrophic wake-up call, we allowed the everyday struggles we see in our communities and across the globe to inspire us to act with empathy? It's in those moments of reaching out to someone different from ourselves that we start to see the threads of humanity that bind us all. This isn't a critique of stories like Watchmen or other similar narratives. They serve as compelling reminders of what we are capable of when pushed to the brink. But they also give us an opportunity to question: why wait for a crisis? Why not build that sense of shared purpose now, before disaster forces it upon us? The truth is, we already have what we need to create stronger, more compassionate communities. It's not more catastrophe, it's more connection. If this reflection resonates with you, please hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Do you think pop culture gets it right? Or do you see evidence in the everyday that proves we don't need catastrophe to remind us of our shared humanity? Let me know your thoughts and how we can strive for connection in our modern world.